I studied architecture undergrad and practiced as an architect for about 7 years. And as an architect, I was just messing around with technology all the time. That's right when, around 2000 and after, when all the architecture firms were moving into like 3D modeling and trying to figure out what to do with it and how to do it. And I just sort of had a knack for computers and 3D modeling and was just messing around with that. And finally, after a few years, I realized I was just more interested in the computers themselves than these huge architectural projects that would take years and years to complete. So I stopped architecture and just started basically mucking around with technology, kind of messing around with it. And I worked on sort of random projects, magazines. I worked with some archaeologists, artists. I was just working with a variety of people who sort of wanted to try and figure out what to do with sort of digital media and digital technologies. I was basically trying to figure out what the limits of the software was and trying to find new ways to use it and trying to sort of wrestle with it to produce unexpected results. And eventually I realized that I just really needed to learn how to program, that's what I was really interested in. Setting up, playing around with systems and processes that I could control sort of every step of the way, rather than sort of really being locked out by the software. So that's when I decided to go back to school. I just figured I needed a couple years of sort of really diving in. That's the place where I'm really interested in intervening, where somebody has set up a kind of system to perform one function, and then there's all the unintended consequences of that system that cause a bunch of reactions, or a bunch of people who come in and exploit that system for different purposes, feeds back into the system, feeds back out, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe not so much in this piece, but I've done a bunch of work finding, they're not really bugs, they're unintended consequences of the way Google Earth works. And basically they take these aerial photographs and map them onto a 3D terrain below, and sometimes that mapping, the program is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's taking photographs and mapping them onto a terrain, but when you have, say, a bridge, for example, the bridge is supposed to be on top of the terrain. It's not supposed to follow the contour. And so when the program does exactly what it's supposed to do, you get these sort of weird roller coaster-like situations. And that's really what I'm interested in. I mean, that's what I love, when you get this artifact or this moment where the system reveals itself, and all of a sudden you re-become aware of what it is that the system has conditioned you to do, or how the system has conditioned you to think, which, most of the time is just sort of implicit, completely unconscious. And there are these weird ruptures where that pops into consciousness and you become really aware of the system and what it's been doing. Those are the moments that I really go after. I'm good friends with John Cayley, but John Cayley considers himself very distinctly a poet, and he works with language, and in particular he's been doing this great series of poems that are based on Google accounts. So he'll write a poem, for example, that only includes terms that have appeared that produce more than 500,000 search results, right? Which means they're very, very, very common terms. Or he'll produce poems entirely made of search terms that only appear, say, under 500 times, which is very, very rare. Or he'll produce poems that only produce 0 results, which means these are word combinations that Google has not yet indexed. And I believe that in most of the poems he was actually using Google Books, so he was kind of limiting those searches to a particular context. But we were talking one day, and a lot of my work has to do with, my previous work has to do with ideas of copies and reproduction. With the Mechanical Turk, it was just copying and copying and copying the same drawing, like the game of telephone. And then the Chinese paintings, obviously intervening in a system that's entirely geared towards handmade, unique copies, which was this sort of weird, interesting moment. And so I began to think of, the singular, right? He was doing all these searches with vast amounts of data, but I kept thinking, okay, well, what about these sort of unique moments? And it was a kind of a big thing in early 2000 when Google first came out. I think it was called a Google whack, was the term that people used when they found multiple words that would only produce one result. But what I really liked with Google Images was there's always this weird connection with Google Images between the search terms that you put in and how those search terms relate to the image. Is it metadata? Is it words that just appear on the same page? Is it in the file name? And so I just began to think okay, let's just decree a bunch of generic images unique because they've been searched for at this particular moment. The other thing, there was a whole component to this that was being shown on Rhizome that was meant to be a downloadable piece. So I had these two kind of conditions, this unique image-word pairing that existed online and this idea of wanting to create something that people had to download. And it kind of fit perfectly because if all these images, these pairings I've created, if anybody puts them online, Google will index them and hence destroy this idea of their being unique. So, by the very act of producing them, I'm also sort of tempting anybody who wants to just kind of destroy them and sort of feed back into that ephemerality. So that's what I was going for when I created this piece, those kind of two tangents. And then also I'm just really, really interested in this, in what you were mentioning earlier, the hapax, and this idea of indistinct meaning, or the idea of pareidolia, like seeing Jesus Christ on a piece of toast. I think missed inputs or blurred inputs and the idea that human desire projects meaning onto all kinds of things was something else that I was seeing happen in these, and that was really exciting. And that's kind of where the name came from. John and I talked about the name for a really long time. And of course, so we were referring to that hapax legomenon, which is in an ancient language, when you only have one occurrence of a particular set of words, there's no way to parse what they mean. And so it's the same thing here, unless one of these is still up and you type in the search term and you find the unique image, you can go to the website and research it. But because most of them are going to disappear, it'll be impossible to know what the relationship between the word and the image was. And so all the stories that you tell yourself may or may not be true, but eventually it'll be impossible to know. And I really love that. I love that you can start to begin to create your own links without ever having a kind of resolution. So that's why I also really like having them just completely out of context. And so that was the idea with just sort of printing them and having them up on a wall, is that if you enter the gallery, you're confronted with the word and the image and the date of its existence, and that's the only thing that you can know about these things. And some of them are, seem completely nonsensical, and some of them seem very obvious, but there's kind of a whole range of meaning in between. And all of the meaning that's ascribed probably comes from the viewer. I mean, except in some very obvious examples, the interpretation is always coming from the viewer, and that's really exciting too.